What role for the UK, for the United Kingdom in a post-Brexit world? And we have another set of absolutely excellent speakers. I would like to congratulate the coordinators of DiCE for producing really such a fabulous programme for yesterday and today, and a great set of speakers. Ian Bond, Michael Keating, Federico Fabbrini and Joe Shaw, all of whom are going to bring fantastic insights into what for me is another depressing set of discussions, because if Brexit is pretty depressing if you're not a member of the Conservative Party, the potential breakup of the United Kingdom is even more depressing. So there's a bit of me that would quite like to keep my camera off, despite the fact that I'm chairing the session, so that you can't see me weeping with the horrors of things that might be about to occur. But for this panel, we've got 3 questions for speakers, and again, an hour. And the first question that we were given was, will the UK stay united post-Brexit, or might the United Kingdom internally differentiate in its relations to the EU? And the suggestion was that Michael Keating might start the answers on this one. If I can see Michael.
I'm here.
Yes, sorry. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Julie. As you said in the chat just now, and as Brigid and Vivian were saying earlier on, the UK position with regard to Brexit has been characterised by an absolute obsession with the notion of sovereignty at the cost of practically everything else. And sovereignty has an external dimension. It also has an internal dimension, because the Brexit project is essentially about reconstituting the United Kingdom as a sovereign and unitary nation state, focused initially on parliamentary sovereignty and then popular sovereignty, and now it seems on executive dominance. But either way, it's about sovereignty and control. But the UK is not that sort of state. The UK itself is a differentiated plurinational union. By the way, I've got a book coming on that, out on that as well next month from Oxford. It is a differentiated union. My argument has been that in this way, it actually resembles the European Union in not having a single demos, a single telos, or a single locus of sovereignty. That is just not at all appreciated in London. Hence the differentiated response to Brexit across the United Kingdom. If we take Scotland, first of all, we know that Scotland voted by 62% to remain. That is held up. This remain vote was not primarily a nationalist vote, because in Scotland, nationalists and unionists voted remain in more or less the same proportions. But that has changed since the referendum, and increasingly support for remain in Scotland is associated with support for independence, and the Leave voters in Scotland have gone back to the Union. There's been a polarisation within Scotland. We can argue about what the polls say today or yesterday, but the best thing to say is opinion is about 50-50 for and against independence, which is a big change, or a significant change, since the Brexit referendum, because it takes it over the 50% threshold. Scotland, however, finds it more difficult to become independent with Brexit because of the question of the hard border. So there's a tension there about the independence question. Meanwhile, there are various moves to try and keep Scotland within European orbit in various ways. The Scottish government has passed the Continuity Act, which gives Scottish ministers the ability to maintain dynamic alignment with European regulations. The UK government has undermined that with an Internal Market Act. That is yet to be played out. The second issue is about migration and freedom of movement. All the parties in the Scottish Parliament are in favour of immigration and freedom of movement, because they defined it as a demographic and an economic issue, and not a cultural issue at all. And they maintained that consensus. They made little headway on that. And thirdly, this is a smaller issue, but the Scottish government a couple of months ago applied to remain within the Erasmus programme, which is fully within devolved competence. And the president of the European Commission said, You can't do that because you're not an independent state, which I have to say it went down extremely badly amongst pro-Europeans in Scotland. But it's almost an invitation, if you look at it another way, to say you better become an independent state. So we've got tensions in that relationship and no clear way of resolving them. But there's a tendency for Scotland to drift into or retain closer to the European pole in many ways. Northern Ireland, similarly, there was a Remain vote, 55%. Amongst nationalists, it was almost 90%, and amongst unionists, 2/3 voted to leave. So immediately it increased the polarization within Northern Ireland, which is already acute enough, as we know. Similarly, there's been a move towards Irish unification, but exclusively amongst nationalists. They now, in the plurality, or I think now actually a majority, support Irish unification in preference to the Good Friday Agreement and the power sharing arrangement, which was not the case. Unionists have not shifted, of course, and they have backed themselves into a very intransigent position, into a ditch around the DUP, with little support from anybody. So Northern Ireland then is polarized. People are talking about Irish unification, but once again, there are enormous obstacles to that happening, not least the need to gain consent from unionists. Meanwhile, we've got the Northern Ireland Protocol, which was always interpreted differently by, on the one hand, the UK, and on the other hand, Ireland and the EU, right back to the first version of the protocol. That is still the case, and that is becoming evident now that they see this quite differently. The protocol is in really serious trouble. The border in the Irish Sea, which Boris Johnson had said he would never accept under any circumstances, does exist. And the UK government has succeeded in alienating both nationalists and unionists in a very serious way. And finally, there's the question of England, which hasn't been given a lot of attention, but we've got a lot of survey research now showing that support for Brexit in England is not associated with feeling very British at all. On the contrary, if you feel more British in England, you tend to be pro-Remain. It's being English that predicts the vote for Brexit. It's a kind of English nationalism. And there are also a series of polls showing that most Leave voters in England would accept the secession of Scotland and Northern Ireland as an acceptable price to pay to achieve Brexit. So you've got these enormous centrifugal tendencies in all four nations right across the United Kingdom. I haven't mentioned Wales, but I could come back to that. And at the same time, the UK government using Brexit as an opportunity to re-centralise, to undermine devolution. So there's a tremendous tension there between the project of global Britain, the sovereign unitary state, and the fact that Northern Ireland, Scotland, and to some degree Wales are being drawn into European and other transnational networks in a differentiated way.
Thank you for an excellent way of starting answers to this question. Could I turn next to Joe Shaw?
You can. Thank you very much. Yes, that indeed was a magisterial summary from Michael of really a lot of the issues that are on the table. I would add my support to a lot, if not everything that he said. He really summed up the issues. If I had something to add to that, I think I would also want to add that the tensions are also playing out in some fields of legal development as well, and specifically what Shona Douglas Scott has called a lurch towards illiberal constitutionalism in the UK, which has played itself out in various forms of creeping constitutional capture relating to the rule of law, human rights, judicial review, separation of powers. So these aren't just I mean, you know, we could have a long debate about the relationship between the constitutional and the political, or between the legal and the political here. But these aren't, quotes, just political developments. They're also being played out in various forms of institutional change. You know, a review of reviews of human rights. I'll come back to, I think, under the heading of the next question, a review on administrative law, on so-called judicial review. All of those things which can be seen in the various conservative manifestos over the years, and have had various different various different variants. What they may also be, though, returning to some aspects of the political, or more particularly the cultural, that what a lot of this is coming straight out of what one might call the populist constitutionalist playbook, and specifically perhaps also some of the authoritarian tendencies that we see in some of the well, particularly perhaps in Orban's Hungary. And the UK is finding some specific domains for culture wars that it wants to develop. We've got the Internal Market Act versus the Continuity Act in the Scottish Parliament, but we've also got issues which are entirely confected and manufactured, for example, that are driving cleavages in British politics and British society, such as, for example, the notion that there isn't freedom of speech in British universities, or specifically because that's the domain of the Westminster government in English universities. Thankfully, those of us working in Scotland are under a different domain. So I think I think there are these huge numbers of tendencies, and while there ought to be the capacity within the Union state to create those sorts of differentiations, there is no reason why one cannot develop a plausible theory and practice of constitutional pluralism within the UK, provided the political will is there. Precisely, we're going in the opposite direction, against constitutional pluralism, and also in an additional move towards an increasingly illiberal constitutionalism.
Thank you. If we could maybe hop over the Irish Sea to Federico and then come back to Ian.
Thanks a lot, Julie. And let me take the opportunity, of course, to thank the organizer, John Eric, Nicolette and Brigid, for inviting me. And as the EY is virtually hosting, and it is my alma mater, let me say it's also a great pleasure to be back home. Now, 3 very quick points from my side. The first, really starting from the title of the panel, and I'll have a little quibble with the organizers in a friendly way, because the title speaks of post-Brexit world, but I'll suggest that actually we are not in a post scenario at all. We are in the midst of Brexit. Brexit hasn't finished, it just started. We see it really play out now. I mean, the decision yesterday by the UK government to postpone custom checks for another 6 months just shows how complicated this process is, and indeed the decision by the UK government last week to extend the grace periods on checks in Northern Ireland again is a demonstrator of how the process has just started. Second point, specifically on Ireland, and thanks, Julie, for putting me on the spotlight as the Irishman of the panel, right? I suppose. But
I didn't quite say that.
The key point there, I think, is that Northern Ireland, the question of Northern Ireland, is really still today the central element of Brexit, and this is shaping both EU-UK relationship, but also more broadly transatlantic relationship. From a legal point of view, what I think has to be emphasized is that the withdrawal agreement has really created a unique status for Northern Ireland, which is now an in-between territory, halfway in the UK and halfway in the European Union. It is a quite unprecedented situation in many respects. Now, if this is the law, the politics, of course, is that this was a compromise that the UK government had to pay in order to get Brexit done. But of course, we see it. This is coming to haunt back Johnson, Frost, and the others, because the deal that the United Kingdom negotiated with the European Union in 2019 effectively sacrificed the DUP, and what I think the United Kingdom government is trying to do now is to remedy it. But the action it is taking, the internal market bill last year, and of course the extension of the grace period last week, are clearly in breach of the agreement. So my final point is what can be done next. Mostly from a legal point of view, I want to emphasize that actually the withdrawal agreement does create a fairly sophisticated mechanism of enforcement to make sure that the UK abides by its legal commitment. On the one hand, we have a dispute settlement system created by the agreement. This is Article 167 et sequitur, that is based around an arbitration tribunal that can be convened by the parties if they claim that the other party has breached the treaty. But more specifically, the protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland in Article 12, Section 4, actually extends to Northern Ireland in the future the normal EU mechanism of law enforcement. And so the Commission could easily bring an infringement proceeding. The ECJ has jurisdiction. Judgment of the court are directly applicable in Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK as far as Northern Ireland is concerned. So the law there, again, in the withdrawal agreement, puts really Northern Ireland in a special regulatory and jurisdictional zone. But the question from a political point of view is what is going to happen, and is the United Kingdom going to honor its obligation under international law? And I think the prior panel has already touched a lot on those issues. It seems quite likely to me that we will see lots of bumps ahead. It is a state of semi-permanent friction, and that doesn't bode well, I think, neither for the stability of the Northern Ireland political process, nor generally for EU-UK relations.
Thank you. And then over to Ian.
Thank you very much. I mean, there's not a whole lot that I can add on the question of the UK's unity. But, you know, listening to Federico talking about expecting bumps ahead, I mean, I think that's exactly what I would expect on the internal front as well. I mean, I have no idea whether Scotland will vote for independence in the next couple of years after the Scottish parliamentary elections this year. Obviously, the internal turmoil within the SNP seems at the moment to be cutting into popular support for leaving the UK. But I don't think that means that the question goes away. And the British government is very ill placed to be able to make the argument against Scottish independence. I mean, it's very hard to say, well, you know, you mustn't vote for this because your economic interests will be seriously harmed, when you have spent the last several years making the argument that the economy be damned, we have to leave the EU in order to regain our own sovereignty. And I do think that the government has trouble understanding that a lot of people in Scotland don't see themselves as part of a kind of London-based polity. So I think the Scottish independence question is going to stay on the agenda. The worst thing that could happen, I guess, is a narrow, you know, 52-48, if I may put it that way, vote in the future in favour of independence that seems to settle nothing. I mean, we talked a lot about Northern Ireland. I also don't think we can completely ignore the fact that that even Wales, which did vote to leave the EU and has traditionally been less inclined to think of independence as a viable option, is now seeing increasing signs of support for, at the very least, more autonomy, more devolution of powers from London. And there's no question that the Internal Markets Act has caused a lot of irritation in Wales as well as in Scotland in terms of limitations on things that the Welsh government would like to do. I mean, one example that I had cited to me was that when it comes to plastic pollution, Wales wanted to have a much broader ban based on EU legislation than the British government wants to have. And effectively, through the Internal Markets Act, the British government has said to the Welsh government, well, even though environmental issues are a devolved competence and you should be able to regulate what kind of plastic is allowed to get into your environment, we're going to override that with the Internal Markets Act. And if we want to come and pollute your landscape, we can do that. And that causes a great deal of resentment, and you can't see that really shrinking over time. You can only see it growing. At the same time, I can't see any British government, but least of all the current one, accepting with equanimity a situation in which Wales and Scotland basically say, well, we're going to follow what Brussels says and not what London says. But the more that London tries to impose uniformity across the UK, the more I think that the SNP-led government in Scotland and the Labour government in Wales will argue that there is no democratic legitimacy in these decisions. And if that sounds like a familiar complaint, so it should. I think, you know, if I were a betting man, I'd probably place a small bet on at least one of Scotland, Wales, or Northern Ireland not being part of the UK by the end of my lifetime, which as a convinced unionist, I think is actually going to weaken us all. But I can understand the forces that are pushing in that direction.
Thank you. The next question follows absolutely logically from where Ian has concluded, because it's what image may prevail, if any, of global Britain versus little England. And obviously the current government has a view of global Britain, or at least it says it wants global Britain. Quite what that's going to mean, we will find out next week in the integrated review of security and defence, which is anything but integrated, because the review is coming before the defence comments. But hey, that's politics for you. But there's clearly something that is symbolically present in the government rhetoric. But the skeptics would say that maybe global Britain is somewhat meaningless. Jo has already flagged up her thoughts about talking about some of the rule of law aspects, and I'll turn to her first on this question.
Thank you very much. So yes, I wouldn't be able to do on this question at this moment the type of sort of scoping statement, if you will, that perhaps was we've seen already in several of the panels in initial introduction of specific questions. But what I would do, of course, is concentrate a little bit on some of the aspects of this. If we look firstly at the relations between the emerging global Britain and the rest of the EU, we've looked at those from a variety of different perspectives in earlier sessions. What I would add to that is that we haven't talked about in detail the inherent complexity of what is now called EU relations law in the UK compared to what we were previously dealing with, and what the consequences of that will be in terms of the impact on the iterative impact on the politics of it, but also the impact on the economy. We've talked about restrictions, but we haven't really talked in detail about the complexity of EU relations law and how difficult that is as a minefield for people to pick their way through. And that EU relations law will have it will have radiating effects also on the UK's relationships with other parts of the world as well, because you can't that can't be avoided. You can't just compartmentalize that in the same way that being part of the EU has had radiating impacts on the relationships of member states with the rest of the world. So EU relations law, although it's not being a member state, will still have some impacts. What I wanted to do, though, specifically was mention the profound sort of narrowing of the UK's horizons. We could mention that the poverty of the Turing scheme, which is the so-called replacement for Erasmus. What perhaps hasn't permeated through to many people yet outside universities is the dramatic axing of UK research and innovation funding for what are called the global challenges for research funds, because the aid budget has been slashed. But that has profound implications for universities supposedly being innovators and leaders in relation to the so-called new global Britain, because just as some of these partnerships, which are delicate, bottom up, need a lot of management, a lot of curation, if you will, just as they're developing. So the budget is being slashed from the UK side because the aid budget has been slashed, and that's going to be, I think, have a profound impact on the extent to which universities can lead on global Britain, other than through loud boasting projects, which seems to be the speciality of the UK government, with little substance behind them. But universities can lead not through boasting, but through actual incremental developments. The other area where we could say a little bit more about the implications for global Britain would be specifically in relation to human rights and the remaining possibility of Brexit plus, namely the exit of the UK, not just from the EU, but also from the ECHR and from the Council of Europe, based on things like a preference for domestic norms for controlling human rights abuses, the use of a so-called British Bill of Rights, and so on and so forth. Some people, would ask, well, is this a further threat, a further element of getting rid of the so-called protected constitution that maintained the UK within the EU orbit for several decades, or is it just a strategic political optic, as Steve Pearce, for example, has called it? Now, there is within the documentation tying the UK to the EU at the moment quite an extended range of different types of ECHR conditionality within the updated political declaration, within various aspects of the TCA. That I could cite various examples of the trade agreement committing the parties both in general terms to respecting human rights, but also some more specific commitments in areas relating to the ECHR and, quotes, giving effect to the rights and freedoms in that convention domestically. So one might ask the question as to whether or not this has ended the debate about leaving the ECHR, or whether that's going to rumble on. It's been attenuated in successive Conservative political party manifestos, so that the 2019 manifesto, on which the current government rests, doesn't even mention the ECHR. But that having been said, that there is conditionality. I don't think we should be in any doubt that we will keep coming back to the conflicted domestic politics, which are currently so souring the relationships between the UK and the EU, and potentially between the UK and many other parts of the world. So the Overseas Operations Bill, limiting the applicability of ECHR rights in certain situations, which I'm sure Julie is extremely familiar with, is part of a strategy of creating perhaps ambiguity and confusion around the nature and scope of the ECHR, in order perhaps to cast ongoing fresh meat to the still strong human rights skeptics in the governing Conservative Party. And at any moment, this could morph back into outright hostility to the ECHR itself. But then, bearing in mind what's happening in Poland and Hungary, it seems that a considerable degree of deviation from ECHR standards is tolerated within the EU. So presumably a state outside the EU, even though it's subject to conditionality and certain forms of compliance, the levers that the EU could pull would be considerably weaker than those regarding member states. So perhaps there is plenty of deviation for the UK, and plenty of signs that the UK will exploit those, notwithstanding the apparently plain wording of the TCA documentation. What that then means for the UK and multilateralism is a matter for the third question, so I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Yes, the ECHR does indeed keep popping up in debates, and the Overseas Operations and Veterans Bill sounds a bit geeky, but one of the clauses does seem to, well, it talks about derogations from the ECHR, and that is viewed by those of us who aren't Conservative peers or MPs perhaps as trying to throw some red meat to those who are sceptical about wider aspects of European cooperation than just the European Union. Ian, can we come back to you?
Yeah, thank you very much, Julie. Well, I mean, you mentioned the long delayed integrated review of security and defence. And so in a way, we're sort of speaking 4 days too early, because that comes out, I believe, next Tuesday, or at least unless it's delayed again. But that will give us a better idea of how the British government sees the UK's future, both in defence, but also in diplomacy and development. And I suppose, I mean, my sense is that, we're seeing what appear to be quite well-informed articles in the press, and the focus seems likely to be on distant horizons and shiny new things. So, the talk is of a stronger UK presence in the Indo-Pacific region, more effort to develop space and cyber capabilities, but a reduced focus on Europe and especially on land warfare. And I think this is consistent with the sense among the strongest supporters of Brexit, certainly people like David Frost, that Brexit has liberated the UK not just from the EU, but from geography. Now, my organisation, the Centre for European Reform, hosted earlier this week a meeting with Greg Hands, the Trade Minister, and I think you can find his opening remarks on the web. But it was a great trumpeting of the government's enthusiasm for joining the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership as a sort of alternative to Europe. And there's a clear sense that the government thinks that the centre of gravity of UK interests should shift from Northwest Europe to the Far East. The other thing that I think we already know about the integrated review is that the government is going to spend more on defence and much less on development than had been previously planned. And I echo some of the sort of underlying concerns in what Joe was saying. I mean, this shifts the focus very much from UK soft power to UK hard power. I think that's a very questionable judgment on how best to protect and promote UK interests, but it certainly will go down well with the Conservative voting base. But I think it will reduce our influence in not only in developing countries, although that's an important issue, but also among countries that themselves remain major donors, including a number in Europe. And it sort of undermines one of the UK's claims to fame, namely that we were just about the only country that met both the NATO target of 2% spending, 2% of GDP spent on defence, and also 0.7% of GDP spent on development aid. And I think that is going to do some damage to our standing. Last thing, I just want to add one point on the ECHR question, and that is that the ECHR is very much woven into the Good Friday Agreement. And I worry quite a lot that those on the Conservative benches who are most enthusiastic about getting out of the ECHR are underestimating the problems that would occur if it looks as though the UK is walking away from that aspect of the Good Friday Agreement, because it's something which is a very important guarantee for the minority community in Northern Ireland. And going forward, that minority community probably inevitably will change as the demographics develop. So what now is seen as a protection for the nationalist community will eventually become a protection for the unionist community.
Thank you. I'm aware we're supposed to have 3 questions, but given we're already halfway through the second question, I'm going to propose to take Federico and then Michael, and then open up the floor for discussion. If we want to come back to wider issues of multilateralism, then that's fine, but I'm anxious that we should have some broader discussion as well. So Federico, and then I'm hoping Michael will return because his camera's just gone off.
Thanks, Julie. Yes, I'll be very quick on this point about global Britain versus Little England. Just approaching this from a slightly different perspective from both Joe and Ian to maybe enrich the conversation. But I think something that I find extremely interesting is how, in reality, Brexit is the paradoxical confluence of two very different trends and very different sort of preferences. On the one hand, you have the right-wing side of the Conservative Party that has been supporting leaving the European Union in the name of global Britain, claiming that the EU was a corpse preventing the UK from striking trade deals across the world and playing, at least in economic terms, the role of a buccaneers of the high seas 2.0. But then on the other hand, Brexit was also strongly supported by the now so-called blue wall of the north, that is an anti-globalization group of cohort or constituency of voters that voted against the EU because they are against the delocalization of production across the world. Now, ironically, these pro-globalization forces and anti-globalization forces came together and made Brexit possible. But I think the key question moving forward is how is the UK government going to find a way that appeases both audiences? And I don't think that will be possible. So this tension between the global Britain that strikes new free trade deals and the little England that instead seeks protection, seeks sort of government supports to rebuild industries in areas where delocalization has damaged communities, will make very hard, I think, for the UK government to find a path forward that keeps it in power for long term. So I think that will be really challenging.
Thank you. Over to Michael.
The others have said most of what I want to say. Joe raised the point of human rights. This is extremely important. It also plays out differently across the nations of the United Kingdom, not just in Northern Ireland, but in Scotland as well. And the implications for Scottish law are really quite distinct. And the great thing about the EHCR across the UK is it separates human rights from questions of nationality and national identity, which are highly contested in Scotland and Northern Ireland, and indeed increasingly in England as well. On the Little England versus global Britain, this is an argument that's being played out within the ruling Conservative Party rather than between the parties. And this was a central ambivalence in the whole of the Brexit project. It's true that there's a neoliberal, globalist, free trading element in the Conservative Party, which has been subdued rather recently, probably as a result, amongst other things, of COVID and the need to spend lots of money. It hasn't gone away, versus, as Fabrizio says, the need to maintain these seats, constituencies in declining areas in Wales and the north of England. We don't know how that's going to work out. On the geostrategic and defence and security matter, I just point to one little incident. We've just been told recently that the UK is going to send an aircraft carrier to the South China Seas to demonstrate British might and awe the Chinese and other neighbouring Asian nations. The only problem is they don't have any aircraft. And this was the result of a prolonged saga about whether we should have one or two aircraft carriers. The second was not cancelled because it was going to cost too much to cancel, and it was being built in the Prime Minister's constituency. So we ended up with two aircraft carriers and no aircraft. And now these have been redeployed to underpin a more recent conception of global Britain. It frankly is quite ludicrous. The ambition of and the scale of this global Britain concept, combined with a unilateralism in the projection of military power and simply the lack of resources to do it. And as the others have said, that is combined with a 30% cut in the overseas development budget, which is inevitably going to reduce Britain's global influence. It doesn't make any sense at all. This also plays differently across the nations of the United Kingdom. This global Britain, this military posturing has more support amongst those English identifying pro-Brexit people in England than it does elsewhere in the United Kingdom. So these cleavages do tend to reinforce each other. What's going to happen about that? I very much doubt it. The aircraft carrier going to the Indian and China seas is then has an American aircraft on board and is being accompanied by a US destroyer, just in case anybody should take it into their heads to shoot at them. So that any attempt at projection in a global thing must be subordinate to the United States, as we see, as far as I see it. There's no remote possibility of Britain having an independent global presence. And we decided 50 years ago that that was the case. And I just find it quite amazing that we should be reversing those 50 years of experience and going back to this global Britain concept.
Thank you. I suspect there are not many paid up Conservative Party members on this call. If there are, I'd be welcome for them to stick their hands up. In the absence of any paid up Tory members, I will just say that what the government would be saying, because they've said it to us many times in answers to parliamentary questions, is that, of course, it may be that the UK doesn't have the aircraft to go on the aircraft carrier, or not enough aircraft at this stage, but that we're part of coalitions and that we're working with the United States. And this demonstrates our cooperative nature. So even if we've left the EU, we're cooperating. So that will be the excuse when we say we don't actually have enough equipment to go alongside the aircraft carriers. As I say, I'll turn over to questions from the audience now, and then if people want to come back for wrap-up comments and talk about multilateralism more generally at the end, that would be fantastic. So the first hand I've got up is Stephen Erlanger from the New York Times.
Thank you, Dr. Smith, very, very much. Now people can see me, unfortunately. I wanted to talk about what you've just mentioned and what Ian was talking about, because as an American who's lived now in Brussels, but spent 9 years of my life covering the UK, the decline of the British military has been rapid and clear. And everyone will say nice things, of course, about the integrated review, but NATO will not be happy. And I don't think Washington will be happy either. The army will go down to about 70,000. It couldn't even get to 82,000. And of course, the last two reviews never saw Britain fighting a war on its own without the Americans. So all that makes a degree of sense. But what I want to just point to quickly is the contradiction here, because Global Britain says we're really important because we're a leading member of NATO, and we will be very important for collective security in Europe, which is true. It's inevitable. I mean, it needs to happen, and you know, we'll help the Americans as we can, and Washington's very grateful for that. But NATO wants a different kind of British military. It doesn't necessarily want an expeditionary force. What NATO has always wanted was more of a land-based force. And the British line has always been, oh, that's up to the Germans. I mean, they've got the tanks, and we're in a new world, and it's a world of cyber and intelligence, which we're very good at, which you are, absolutely. But in terms of a British military that could actually get anything done, will it be able to? I mean, we've always relied on Britain to have at least one corps, you know, and I'm not sure that's going to be true anymore. Now, I realize governments have to balance expense, and this is a terrible time. All that's true, but I just want to put that out there and try to get reactions from the panel, and thank you all for your indulgence.
Thank you very much indeed. Ian, could I come back to you on this one?
Yes, thanks very much, Steve. I mean, I think, I mean, there is some substance in the British argument that they can do things in NATO other than land forces. in terms of naval power and air power. And there is some force in the argument that were the Germans to invest in their defense, the Bundeswehr in the Cold War was certainly a lot more capable on land than the British Army of the Rhine was at that time. And, were the Germans to start taking defense seriously again, there's no reason to suppose that they couldn't do that again. What worries me is that there are a lot of problems in the North Atlantic, and with the thawing of the Arctic and the opening up of routes across the Arctic, there are a lot more problems there as well. But the British government has been seduced by the South China Sea. I understand the attractions of desert islands with palm trees, but actually, we've got problems closer to home. And I am concerned that the integrated review is not really going to face up to that. I think we will continue to contribute to NATO. But I agree with you. I don't think we will necessarily be contributing the things that the US would most like us to contribute. And particularly if the US feels that it has to divert more and more of its own Navy to the Asia-Pacific theater, it probably will be looking to European allies to do more of the heavy lifting in the North Atlantic. And I just don't see, with the kind of thinking that lies behind the integrated review, that we'll be in a good position to do that.
Thank you. Would any of the other panelists like to come in on this question?
Can I jump in, maybe Julie?
Yep.
Just thanks Stephen for the question, and maybe use it to highlight another point. I mean, his question about NATO and the UK in it, I think, raises a couple of other interesting issues. One is generally the diminishing role of the UK in foreign policy. We see it a lot with Hong Kong these days, the inability basically of Britain to sort of make sure that China is sticking to the agreement of 1998. And I think that is a strong signal of, if you will, the long-term effects of Suez 70 years afterwards. That's I think a point worth emphasizing in the scope of this conversation. But the other is how influential the United States remains still today in all this discussion about Brexit. And I am abusing your question, Stephen, here to make a point that I think I didn't have the chance to make before, but most people will know next week the US Senate will vote a resolution calling for respecting the Northern Ireland Protocol in the framework of the Good Friday Agreement. Next Wednesday is St. Patrick's Day, so the Irish community is obviously mobilizing very much, but I think that will play a major role in Brexit. I mean, the Biden effect was already visible, in my view, in the conclusion of the TCA. We can't write history in hindsight, but I think if Trump had won the election in the United States, it is quite plausible that the UK might have exited the transition period without a deal. I think the pressure coming from a Democratic victory in the US was a key factor in ultimately pushing at Christmas Britain to strike a deal with the EU, and the staunch support of the US administration, and of course, Nancy Pelosi in the House of Representatives, but also the Senate, as I said, I think will be relevant, and we will see it in the next few weeks. I think the US, perhaps against its maybe its instinct, but will have to remain committed and play a role on issues connected to Northern Ireland and EU-UK relationship on defense, but other issues as well. So that's a point worth continuously following, I'd say.
Thank you, Joe.
Yes, can I just add something to the broader question of the UK as a multilateral partner, which lies behind, obviously, the question about defence and partnering with the US on those sorts of issues, and staying and developing the transatlantic relationship in a distinctive way post Brexit. But Fabio mentioned already the changes that, Federico mentioned already the changes relating to the shift in American politics and the dramatic shift between a Trumpian perspective on international law and a Biden perspective on international politics. And to that extent, one wonders to what extent the UK is reading the room in some of the things that it continues to do. It's definitely not built up a reputation that it's going to be a very reliable international partner. So one wonders, for example, if it were to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and I recognize that those types of international agreements are very different to the nature of EU law or the very specific nature of the international agreements that are hedging around the issue in Northern Ireland. But nonetheless, the UK has no reputation as a reliable partner at the present time. And on the contrary, it's developing a reputation more and more as a country that moves its international problems offshore, as it's shown with the citizenship stripping practices that have really taken off in the last decade or so in the UK, and which have received clear judicial approval, if you will, in the Shamima Begum case in the Supreme Court, which raises some very complex questions about the relationship between the judiciary and the executive, which which have external effects as well as internal ones.
Thank you, Michael. I can see you've now got your hand up. There is, to come back in, there's also a question from Brigid, which I'd quite like you to open on, and then Angela's got her hand up. I'm hoping the organisers might allow us to go until 15:15, given the previous session overran by 3 minutes. So if we overrun by 5 on this session, is that acceptable? Still leaves 15 minutes. Brigid, could you give your question, and then Michael, you can respond on both, if that's okay.
So I've written the question in the chat, but very briefly, my question is that regardless of whether any of the component parts of the UK become independent or break away, that it seems to me that Brexit has also placed extraordinary pressure on the devolution settlement. We've seen it with the Internal Markets Bill, and I'm wondering how can Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast resist this tendency to centralisation and uniformity that we see from London?
Michael, over to you.
Okay, can I get my little point first and then I'll answer Brigid's point?
Yeah, absolutely.
My point following the previous discussion was we need to distinguish between the concept of transatlanticism, a turn from Europe to transatlanticism and privileging relationships with the United States, from this idea of global Britain, which is an idea that Britain alone will go its own, or it will determine alliances ad hoc on a particular basis. And what I was suggesting was that the alternative to Europe is subordination to the United States. I think that's what we're going to get, rather than a genuine third pole, as people dreamed of after the Second World War. And I think the other issue that illustrates that clearly is the nuclear deterrent, which is entirely dependent on the United States, but is presented as an independent British nuclear deterrent. And it's not just the Conservative Party that's behaving this way. The Labour Party is going in exactly the same direction on those issues. On Brigid's points, yes, indeed, we're seeing a recentralisation, partly because of the Brexit-related legislation undercutting powers or taking powers back. We're also quite separately seeing the UK government spending in the devolved territories. There's the proposal, which will never go away and it will never happen, for a fixed link between Scotland and Northern Ireland. This is the kind of thing that really just destabilizes the understanding of devolution, but responds to the political imperatives of the government in London to want to do something about the union. It doesn't know quite what to do about the union. The nationalists are not winning this argument, but the unionists are certainly losing the argument and behaving in a rather gauche way in their interventions. What can the devolves do about it? Not a lot, because in Northern Ireland, the executive itself is deeply divided about these things and not able to speak clearly on these issues, so tends not to be involved. Scotland and Wales have been working together quite a bit, although they have very different long-term views about the union. They've been working together. Some of the most interesting thinking has been really coming from Wales, from the Welsh government, about rethinking the nature of the union. They're a unionist government, but they want a different kind of union. But it's very difficult to pull all this together. And then you have people who say the answer is federalism, which they've been saying since Gladstone's day in the 19th century, and never defined what federalism is. So there's a lot of talk about this, but not an effective counter fight back against what is seen as being, and not just by nationalists, but by unionists as well, across Scotland and Wales, as a re-centralising strategy. The only thing you can say about it is that the UK government's attempt to re-centralise will probably not work, because it just doesn't have the capacity. It doesn't actually exist on the ground. It has sporadic interventions in Scotland and Wales, but it's just not there on the ground to do this centralisation. So it's looking very untidy, but these ad hoc moves, whether it's by the nationalists or unionists, just create more politicisation of issues that might otherwise be seen as technical. This is parallel to what goes on in the EU, of course, as well. Increasing tensions and no obvious way out. No clear resolution of these tensions.
Thank you. Can I take Angela's question, then I'll come to all of the speakers to respond and give any final comments.
Thank you, Julie. So I'm Angela from the University of Glasgow. I'm a European historian and a former alumna of the UI. I have two questions. Written thing. So my view is that this is completely delusional, and it's pretty clear to all the partners because of the capabilities, because of the systematic attitude of this Tory government to let's say, not comply with the fundamental principle of pacta sunt servanda. So Joe was underlining that this is not a credible partner. So my question is, where is the interest to have a cooperation with the UK? Because to me, the UK is the demander. It's not NATO or the EU or the United States who need the UK. It's the other way around. And the second question, but you take whichever you want if there is no time, probably to Michael, but to anyone else. So I attended a very intriguing series of conferences by the University of Oxford about the constitutional problems in the UK. And there was I don't remember the speaker, I'm sorry, but there was an argument that basically this Tory party would be very, very happy with an independent Scotland, because that would guarantee virtually endless Tory government in the rest of the UK. It's just that they're playing chickens. They don't want to be, nobody want to be seen as the prime minister who lost Scotland. Is just, you know, this sort of image, while the Labour has the only interest in keeping Scotland. So I was wondering whether you have any comments on that.
Wow. A minute each for the speakers. Ian.
Yeah, okay. So I think one important thing is that, I mean, I don't know whether it's fair to call it the David Frost doctrine, but I think there is a real shift in the UK's attitude to multilateralism, that commitments are essentially always negotiable. And I think, you know, that puts us much closer to sovereigntist states like China, Russia, and indeed to the US than it does to EU member states. And I think that is going to be a problem for us going forward, because we're not on the same scale, particularly as the US and China, and we're not able to operate on our own. And if you try then to operate on a completely transactional basis with others, I think it is going to be very difficult. I think Angela's question about who is the demandeur, yeah, we are more often than not going to be the demandeur. Any country that basically views international commitments as there to be broken is going to pay a price in terms of its own leverage with partners. I think there's a correlation, as so often, between the UK achieving aims through multilateral cooperation and UK willingness to limit its own freedom of maneuver and to sign up to obligations and to live with them.
Federico.
Thank you, Julie. I will not focus on the questions that Fabian and Brigid were raising about sort of decentralization and devolution, as I think Michael and Joe have already actually touched extensively on it. But picking up on Angela's point about how reliable a partner the UK is, I think that is a big challenge, and we are seeing it with the decision of the European Parliament to basically put on hold the ratification of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. I mean, that's quite unprecedented, where the Parliament says, well, what's the point for us in going forward in giving our consent to the entry into force of this treaty if the UK is not abiding to the treaty we signed up last year? Now, that is actually quite something that is, significant, because as people will know, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement is provisionally in force. It was meant to be in force for 2 months until the end of February. A decision was taken to extend it until April. But from a legal point of view, I think there are really strong limits to the possibility of rolling over a provisional application of the treaty if the Parliament is not willing to sort of vote on it. And that means very practically that we might be 6 weeks short of a really, really hard Brexit, because at the end of April, if the TCA has not been finally voted by the Parliament, we might even have custom tariffs apply. It's not just the bureaucracy of customs declaration, but really the full WTO set of norms kicking in at the end of April. So essentially, what I think we are going through at the moment is a complex phase with lots of uncertainty. That has been really the case since 2016 in many ways, but it's the same old carrying forward. And I think the UK is approaching all this really from a purely political perspective. They don't seem to care a lot about the legal aspects of the relationship with the EU. It's a permanent state of negotiations, and in such a situation, you might very easily sleep on a banana at some point.
Michael.
I'll just take about Angela's questions about whether the Conservatives would be happy with Scottish independence, and the answer is some of them would. We have survey evidence showing that quite a lot of Conservative voters would be indifferent, at least indifferent to Scottish independence, and actively support Irish unity. Indeed, a few years ago, there was a survey of Conservative candidates, I think it was, most of whom were elected, saying that a surprising number of them, almost half, were quite indifferent as to the independence of Scotland, but they're a minority, and that most Conservatives do not want Scotland to become independent because they're unionists, and this would certainly apply to any UK Conservative Prime Minister. There is an interesting division in the Conservative Party at the moment between those who take the union seriously, let's put it that way, that it is a union, that it's not a unitary state, and they need to learn about it and understand it better, and those who think that the UK is a unitary state and that's just the end of it. And the only answer is to take a hard line with nationalists. The union unit is now the Union Directorate. It's had a huge churn of people and directors and advisors and formats over the last few months, and even in the last couple of weeks, I think they've had 2 directors in succession. This is about being fought out within the UK government about what to do about Scotland, and to some degree about Northern Ireland and Wales as well, and reflecting different understandings of the union. So it'd be very interesting to see how that works out and what strategy the UK government eventually comes up with. It's been proposing to publish a strategy for the last year or so. Nothing has appeared, but we'll promise something shortly, some kind of statement as to the way they see the union working out in future.
Last word to Joe.
Well, I don't want to keep people from their brief coffee breaks. It's been very illuminating. I think I would just add to the points that, as it were, bring the points made by Federico and Michael together there, in the sense of saying that this could play out in not just the political crisis, but potentially a constitutional crisis for the UK. And that's clearly going to preoccupy and use up a lot of, as it were, the resources of state. And I'm not sure how much capacity there is to react to that in constructive ways. So we do appear to be going through not just an uncertain phase, but also a highly destructive phase. And that has implications, I think, for the UK standing in the world, for its self-understanding as a state, as a union state. If that is, that's not a unanimous view within the UK, as Michael says, plenty of people see it as unitary. But it also is likely to play out in real impacts on people's living standards, and that I think is one reason why we continue to be concerned about these questions.
Thank you. My apologies for overseeing such a depressing panel. It wasn't my fault. It's the questions that have been asked and the result of some of my compatriots having voted to leave the European Union, for which I can only apologise. I also apologise for overrunning slightly, but I hope you'll agree with me that all four of our speakers were absolutely worth listening to. And if we could have had another hour, that would have been even better. But thank you to all of the speakers, and look forward to hearing the next session in 11 minutes' time.